much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, I'm always delighted to be in North Carolina, particularly this time of year. It's very beautiful. And on an occasion like this, congratulations to all the new leaders of the party. And, I believe, quite frankly, that this country is on the verge of waking up and recognizing what God planned for us to be. I think we went to sleep for a little while, but I think people are actually starting to wake up. And a lot of the things that have happened recently have created so much turmoil, and sometimes things have to get pretty dark before people actually wake up. A lot of times people say, why would you find yourself in a situation where you might soil your reputation with politics? Well, sometimes you don't have a whole lot to do with it. I was shocked a couple of years ago when I was asked to be the speaker at the National Prayer Breakfast, because I had done it 17 years earlier and I wasn't aware that anybody ever did it twice. But after some investigation, I discovered one person had done it twice, and that was Billy Graham. Well, I said, those are pretty big shoes to fill. I said, Lord, I said, Lord, what are you up to here? Because, I'm getting near the end of my career. I want to retire and relax. And it seems like you may have something else in mind. Well, I wasn't sure what I was supposed to say until that morning. When I awakened that morning, it was so clear. And it just resonated with so many people. And I'm not 100% sure what the Lord's ultimate purpose is here. And I have to confess that going into politics was not something that appealed to me at all. I really didn't want to do it. But I finally said, Lord, as long as you continue to open the doors, I'll walk through them. And if you close them, I'll sit down. And he just keeps opening the doors, so I keep walking through them. And that's where we are right now. But I can remember as a youngster, I wasn't a very good student, as you know, until my mother made us start reading. And, this was back in the days when you had to do what your parents told you to do. So, there was no social psychologist saying let the kid express themselves. So, you had to read. And I started reading all kinds of things, and I began to gain all kinds of knowledge. But I remember one of the things that really struck me is reading the story of Joseph in the Bible. What an amazing story that was to me. This guy sold into slavery by his own brothers. Did he say, bummer, my own brothers sold me into slavery? No. He said, if I'm going to be a slave, I'll be the best slave there is. And he went on to be appointed to head up the household of Potiphar, the captain of the Egyptian guard, a very responsible position. And then, Potiphar's wife sees him and says, well, that's a good-looking dude. I want to deal with him. But, he has values. He does not submit to her seduction. And he ends up being thrown into prison. Now, Potiphar did not believe his wife, or he would have had him executed. But he had to save face for her. But anyway, he ends up in prison. Does he say, bummer, here I am living up to all the values and principles that I know, and I end up in prison? No. He says, if I'm going to be a prisoner, I'll be the best prisoner there is. And he ends up with a responsible position in the prison, ends up interpreting dreams, ends up as governor of Egypt, the most powerful nation in the world at that time. And what that story really said to me is it doesn't matter where you start from. It matters where you finish. And how do you finish well? With faith and courage. And those are the things those are the kinds of things that played such a dramatic role in the rise of this nation. From nowhere, from obscurity, to the pinnacle of the world in record time. People had faith and people had courage. You think about the fact that people thought a lot about education early on in this country. In places like the Massachusetts Bay Colony, if you didn't have adequate public education, your community was fined. That's how much we cared about it. And when Alexis de Tocqueville came here to study America, he was blown away, this is back in 1831, of how well educated the people were. He could find a mountain man in the outskirts of society, and the guy could read the newspaper, could explain to him how the government worked, could have a decent conversation. Only the aristocracy in Europe were able to do that. And it was that reliance on education that gave us that can-do attitude that allowed people to move from one coast to the other across a rugged and hostile terrain, because people knew how to do things and people cared about each other. You know, there were many communities spread out across this nation, in many cases separated by hundreds of miles from any other community. Why were they able to thrive and to grow? Because people cared about each other. You know, if a farmer was up in an apple tree getting apples and he fell out and broke his leg and it was harvest time, guess what? Everybody else pitched in and harvested his crops. If somebody got killed, everybody else pitched in and took care of their family. And it's the nature of Americans to actually be compassionate and to care about other people. And I think that that's one of the reasons that we were able to rise so rapidly. And if you want to talk about an exceptional nation, when you think about the state of the world, for 100 years before America came along, 1,000 years before America came along, 5,000 years before America came along, people did things the same way. Within 200 years of the advent of America, men were walking on the moon. Changed the pattern of the entire world. This is the most exceptional nation the world has ever known. And people who don't realize that, and that doesn't mean that we haven't made some mistakes, because this nation is populated by human beings. And human beings are not perfect. But it does mean that of all the nations that have ever existed in the world, this is the one that had the kinds of values and the kinds of principles that allowed it to really excel. And our values and principles are there because we are people of faith. You know, I remember a few years ago, I was in the operating room, and I get a call, and it was from the university lawyers. And they said, the state of Florida is trying to garnish your wages for child support. I said, what? I said, I have 3 children. I support them very well. And they said, no, there's a lady in Florida, and she says that you are the father of her son. And she knows where you went to high school, college, medical school, internship, residency. She even has a picture of you in scrubs. I said, anybody can get that. Are you kidding me? But on the basis of that, a paternity suit. And I had to get my lawyer involved, and it escalated. And then they said, send us a blood specimen so we can do DNA testing. I said, excuse me? You people, as incompetent as you are, want me to send you a blood specimen? I said it'll end up at a murder scene and I'll be in jail for the rest of my life. Are you kidding me? So then it escalated a bit more. And then it just, poof, it died. It was gone. They gave up. Why? Because I faced them boldly. And why was I able to face them boldly? Because I knew something they didn't know. A lot of times they assume that someone like me who's out and about all over the place is messing around, probably doesn't even realize all the people they've been messing around with, and they want to protect their reputation, so they'll just fork out the money. But I knew that the only woman I'd ever slept with in my whole life was my wife, so I didn't have to scratch my head. You know? And that's what I mean by the kinds of values and principles that we grasped as a nation that really helped us tremendously. And this is not to say that people don't make mistakes and do things, but you know, the fewer skeletons you put in the closet, the fewer skeletons anybody can find. And it makes a very big difference. And even if you do put skeletons in the closet, having the integrity to do the right thing makes a difference. You know, Alexander Hamilton, you know, way back in the early stages of our country, you know, he got trapped into a situation where he had an affair, and it was actually planned by this woman and her husband so they could blackmail him. But you know, Alexander Hamilton had the integrity to just come out and say, yep, I did it. It was a boneheaded thing. It was stupid. I wish I hadn't done it. And he exposed himself to the populace, and they forgave him. And the blackmail scheme disappeared. And you know, that's the way our God is. If we're willing to be honest, if we're willing to live up to the values and principles, he recognizes that we make mistakes. And that's the reason that he sent his son to die for our sins. But we have to accept what he has done. And we have to let that be reflected in our character. Well, that's the faith part. What about the courage part? Do you realize that in this nation today, the vast majority of people actually have common sense? And the vast majority of people actually embrace the traditional values that made this into a great nation. But I'll tell you what has happened. We have not embraced courage. We have been beaten into submission. And people are afraid to actually express their beliefs because someone will call them a name, they'll get an IRS audit, somebody will mess with their job or with their family, and it's easier just to keep your head down. Well, you know what? That's exactly what Saul Alinsky realized. And that's why in his book, Rules for Radicals, he emphasized how important it is to intimidate the majority, to make them believe that what they think is something that only morons believe, and that what you think is what the intelligentsia believe. And he really doesn't care whether you accept the secular progressive agenda as long as you keep your mouth shut. They really don't care whether you agree with them. Just shut up and let them drive the boat. And that's what's been happening for the last several decades. Well, you know, it's really time to bring courage back. It's time to really stand up for what we believe in and stop letting them drive the boat, because it's going in the wrong direction. And, I'm reminded of a case where this young man had a terrible disease called von Hippel-Lindau disease, which causes tumors to grow in various parts of the brain. And it's a devastating disease and usually kills people relatively early in adulthood. Well, this young man had developed a tumor in the middle of his brainstem, in an area we call the pons. And his wife, it turns out, was a nurse. And she was a nurse on the pediatric neurosurgery service at Johns Hopkins. And none of the adult neurosurgeons would operate on him. So she said, Ben, you need to operate on my husband. I said, but I'm a pediatric neurosurgeon. He says, and she said, well, he acts like a child. And, I really wasn't anxious to operate on somebody's brainstem either, to be honest with you. I fully understood why nobody else wanted to do it. But the problem was I could not escape her. And she just kept pounding on me. And finally I said, okay, I'll go talk to him. And, I told him that there was no better than a 50-50 chance that he would survive such an operation. And he said, I understand that, doctor, but if you don't do the operation, there's a 100% chance that I'm going to die. So I'll take 50-50 any day. And I thought that was a pretty mature attitude. And I went down to the area of the brainstem, and there were all these new blood vessels that had grown in there to feed the tumor. And it was very complex, but I finally found an area where I could get through the blood vessels to the brainstem and open up a small hole in the brainstem. And I couldn't open up a hole big enough to see, but I could open up a hole big enough to introduce micro-instruments under the microscope, and I could feel the capsule of the tumor. So I grabbed it, started slowly trying to pull it out using another instrument to free it up from the tissue around it. And that's all done by feel. You can't actually see. And then the anesthesiologist announced the brainstem auditory evoked potentials are flat. The little waves that indicate neurological function had gone flat. And he said, you killed them. Because he was very much opposed to the operation in the first place. And he was gloating over the fact that he was right, that I killed this patient. And, of course, we were very somber at that moment, but just continued to deliver the tumor until it was all out. Closed up, very somber mood. Sent him to the ICU. And I went home. Obviously, he didn't wake up. But when I came in the next morning, he was extubated, sitting up in the bed, cracking jokes. Now, why did I have the courage to take on that kind of an operation? I'll tell you the reason is because some years earlier than that, in another very difficult case that actually turned out well, and no one thought that it was any possibility. And the oncologist involved in that case told me afterwards that he was an atheist, but now he was a believer. But during that, I realized that it really wasn't me. And I said, Lord, you be the neurosurgeon, and I'll be the hands. And it was after that that all the amazing things began to occur in my neurosurgical career. I had a career that was beyond belief. I couldn't have typed that out if somebody had sat me down and said, type out the career you want to have. Because God was doing all of that for a reason. He was giving me all the various experiences for a reason. He was helping me to overcome impossible situations for a reason. And it was to strengthen your faith and to give you courage in the face of situations that people say are impossible. And we have to remember that all the people who preceded us, our forefathers in this nation, faced impossible odds. People thought that there was no possibility that a ragtag bunch of militiamen could defeat the most powerful empire on earth and the most professional army. But they did. They got together, those people, and they talked in their town hall meetings, in their barns, in their living rooms. What kind of country did they want to have? What were they willing to fight for? What were they willing to die for? And that was the kind of courage that allowed them to succeed. You had people like Nathan Hale, became a spy as a teenager, caught by the British, ready to be executed. He said, "My only regret is that I have but one life to give for my nation." You want to talk about courage. And what about all of those soldiers in D-Day, 71 years ago, as they stormed the beaches of Normandy, being mowed down by machine gun fire, hundreds laying there on the beach, 1,000 bodies dead in the sand? But did our soldiers turn back? Were they frightened? Yes, they were frightened, but they didn't turn back. They stepped over the bodies of their dead comrades, and they overwhelmed the Axis forces, knowing in many cases that they would never see their homeland or their loved ones again. Why? Why did they do that? They did it for you, and they did it for me, so that we could be free in this land. And the question is, what are we willing to do? Because the baton of freedom is in our hands right now. Are we going to give away our values and our beliefs for the sake of political correctness? Or are we going to stand like those who preceded us and hold the baton of freedom high and pass it on to the next generation in wonderful shape so that they, in fact, can live in one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all? Thank you.